The morning of November 9th, 1944, the waters southwest of Kyushu, Commander Torisu Kenyo stood on the bridge of the destroyer Shimakaze as dawn broke over the East China Sea. Before him, a convoy of 9 tankers crawled toward Sasebo at 8 knots, their hulls laden with fuel from the Dutch East Indies. Behind him, 3 other destroyers formed a protective screen against the threat. Every Japanese naval officer now feared more than enemy surface ships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. More than carrier aircraft, more than any weapon in America's arsenal, the submarines. In the 4 months since he had assumed command of this convoy escort route, Kenyo had watched 12 tankers disappear beneath these waters, not to aerial attack, not to mines, to American submarines that seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with devastating precision, and vanish before his destroyers could respond. The previous week, intelligence officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo had briefed escort commanders on what they called the submarine situation. The briefing had lasted 7 hours. What Kenyo heard that day shattered everything he had learned at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy about how wars were fought and won. The Americans, intelligence reported, now operated more than 200 submarines in the Pacific. 200. When the war began in December 1941, Japanese naval intelligence had estimated the United States possessed perhaps 70 submarines capable of Pacific operations. Most of those, the intelligence officers had assured fleet commanders, were obsolete S-class boats from the previous war, suitable only for coastal defense. The Americans would use their submarines as Japan used hers, as scouts for the battle fleet, as platforms for attacking enemy warships, as auxiliary units in the great decisive battle that would determine control of the Pacific. But the Americans had done something unprecedented in naval warfare. They had committed their submarine force not to fleet actions, but to commerce raiding on a scale that dwarfed even Germany's U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. And they were building submarines faster than Japan could count them, faster than Japan could sink them, faster than seemed possible for any nation to construct such complex vessels of war. Standing on Shimakaze's bridge that November morning, Kenyo understood with terrible clarity that his convoy would likely not reach port intact. Somewhere in the vastness ahead, American submarines prowled designated patrol areas, their commanders reading intercepted Japanese convoy routes as easily as if they were printed in American newspapers. The submarines would come. They always came. The only questions were when and how many of his ships would survive. What Commander Kenyo could not know, what no Japanese officer yet fully comprehended, was the staggering industrial reality behind the submarine threat. The United States was not simply deploying submarines, it was mass-producing them with assembly line efficiency that Japan's most optimistic pre-war assessments had deemed impossible. Between 1941 and 1944, American shipyards would commission more submarines than Japan possessed merchant vessels. The empire that had planned for a short, decisive war now faced an enemy that built weapons of commerce destruction faster than Japan could construct the merchant ships. Those weapons were designed to sink. The story of how Japanese naval commanders confronted this reality represents one of the most profound miscalculations in modern military history. It is a story of doctrine meeting industrial capacity, of assumptions colliding with material fact, of a navy prepared to fight one kind of war, discovering it faced another entirely. It begins not with the submarines themselves, but with the strategic thinking that made Japan blind to their true threat until that threat had become existential. In 1905, the Imperial Japanese Navy achieved what many considered impossible. At the Battle of Tsushima, Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet in a single, decisive engagement. 38 Russian ships entered the battle. By its conclusion, only 3 had escaped. It was the kind of victory that shapes naval thinking for generations. The decisive battle doctrine, what Japanese naval strategists called Kantai Kessen, became the cornerstone of Imperial Navy planning. One great battle, fought by battleships supported by cruisers and destroyers, would determine supremacy in any future war. Every weapon, every tactic, Every training exercise pointed toward that single climactic moment. Submarines, in this doctrinal framework, served a supporting role. They would scout ahead of the battle fleet, providing intelligence on enemy movements. They would whittle down enemy strength through opportunistic attacks on warships. They might help achieve the numerical advantage needed when the decisive battle finally occurred. But submarines were not decisive weapons in themselves. They could not hold territory. They could not destroy enemy fleets in single engagements. They were auxiliaries, useful but secondary. This thinking was not unique to Japan. Before December 7, 1941, United States Navy doctrine also emphasized fleet actions and regarded merchant shipping as a secondary target. The London Naval Treaty of 1930, to which both nations were signatories, required submarines to follow cruiser rules when attacking merchant vessels. Surface warnings, time for crews to evacuate, provisions for survivors. Both navies designed their submarines primarily for attacks on warships, which were faster, more maneuverable, and better defended than merchant ships. But when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, something changed in American naval thinking with startling speed. 6 hours after the attack, United States Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark issued a directive that would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings. No provisions for survivors. Any vessel in Axis-controlled waters became a legitimate target. The Americans had abandoned the cruiser rules and embraced total war at sea. The Japanese naval establishment, however, continued to view American submarines through the lens of their own doctrine. Japanese intelligence analysts assumed American submariners would follow the same strategic thinking that guided Japanese submarine operations. They would lurk near major bases, hoping to intercept capital ships. They would support fleet operations. They would avoid the difficult, time-consuming work of hunting merchant convoys across the vast Pacific. Captain Oi Atsushi, who later served at Grand Escort Fleet Headquarters, would recall after the war that Japanese naval planners took it for granted that American submarines would function much like Japanese submarines, focusing on warships rather than merchant shipping. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong, but in early 1942, Japanese confidence seemed justified by results. American submarines in the first year of war were notably ineffective. Of the 29 American submarines in the Asiatic Fleet when war began, none achieved significant success in the defense of the Philippines, despite scoring numerous direct hits on Japanese vessels. The problem was technical rather than tactical. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard armament for United States fleet submarines, suffered from 4 major defects that rendered it reliable only about 20% of the time. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing beneath targets without exploding. The magnetic exploder designed to detonate warheads below enemy hulls often failed to function or detonated prematurely. When torpedoes did hit targets directly, contact exploders, it frequently failed to detonate. Japanese naval officers watched American submarines struggle through 1942 and concluded their assessment had been correct. American submarines posed no serious threat. In that first year, United States submarines mounted approximately 350 war patrols and sank about 180 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 725,000 tons. Significant, but not decisive. The Japanese merchant fleet at war's outbreak possessed more than 6 million tons of shipping capacity. At the 1942 loss rate, Japan could sustain the war indefinitely. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was that American submarine ineffectiveness in 1942 resulted not from strategic incompetence or inferior training, but from correctable technical problems and institutional obstacles that American naval leadership was systematically eliminating. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who assumed command of Pacific submarine forces, approached the torpedo problem with methodical determination. He conducted live-fire tests that definitively proved the Mark 14's defects. He fought bureaucratic battles with the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, which had initially refused to acknowledge the problems. By September 1943, the torpedo defects were corrected. More importantly, Lockwood removed cautious submarine commanders and replaced them with aggressive skippers who understood commerce raiding. Simultaneously, American codebreakers achieved a breakthrough that transformed submarine warfare in the Pacific. In January 1943, Allied intelligence finally cracked what submariners called the Maru Code, the Japanese cryptographic system used to route merchant convoys through the Empire's waters. Before the code break, American submarines had to search vast ocean areas hoping to intercept convoys by chance. After January 1943, American submarines received specific positions and courses for Japanese merchant ships. Submarine skippers no longer hunted blindly. They intercepted convoys on predictable routes with devastating precision. The combination of working torpedoes, aggressive commanders, and signals intelligence created in 1943 what historians would later identify as a turning point for Japanese merchant shipping. In that single year, American submarines sank approximately 335 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 1.5 million tons. The numbers had doubled from the previous year. Bulk commodities reaching Japan fell from 19.4 million tons in 1942 to 16.4 million tons in 1943. The reduction represented 4 months of imports, 4 months of oil, steel, rubber, and food that never reached Japanese factories or Japanese civilians. Yet even these losses, severe as they were, did not fully reveal the crisis confronting Japan. The submarine campaign was not merely sinking ships, it was sinking them faster than Japan could replace them. And behind the submarines already deployed lay an industrial mobilization that Japanese planners had never anticipated, could barely comprehend, and absolutely could not match. On December 7, 1941, the United States Navy deployed 56 submarines in the Pacific. These included 12 elderly S-class boats designed during the previous war, considered obsolete even by American standards. The remainder were modern fleet submarines, Tambor-class, Salmon-class, Sargo-class boats designed for extended Pacific operations. 56 submarines represented less than 2% of the United States Navy, yet they would ultimately sink more than 60% of Japanese merchant shipping. The submarines themselves were remarkable vessels, products of interwar American naval thinking that had anticipated Pacific warfare's unique demands. American fleet submarines displaced approximately 1,500 tons surfaced, roughly twice the size of German Type 7 U-boats that dominated the Atlantic. They measured more than 300 feet long and could cruise 20,000 miles without refueling, enabling patrols lasting 60 days or more across the vast Pacific. They carried 24 torpedoes and mounted deck guns that could surface attack small vessels, conserving torpedoes for major targets. More importantly, American submarines offered amenities unimaginable in other navies' boats. They featured air conditioning, essential in tropical waters where humidity could condense inside electrical systems, causing shorts and fires. They had freshwater distillation units, allowing extended patrols without dependence on shore facilities. They provided refrigerated food storage, hot showers, and bunks for every crew member. German U-boat crews, by contrast, slept in shifts, sharing bunks in vessels without climate control. Japanese submarine crews endured similar conditions. American submarines were designed not just for combat effectiveness but for crew endurance across the Pacific's vast distances. Japanese naval intelligence knew these facts. What they failed to grasp was American industrial capacity to produce such sophisticated vessels in numbers that would overwhelm Japan's ability to respond. In 1941, Japan possessed 190 submarines, many of them large, long-range boats technically superior to American vessels. Japan had built some of the world's most advanced submarines, including boats that could carry aircraft and submarines with ranges exceeding 20,000 miles. Japanese planners assumed this technological sophistication, combined with numerical advantages, would offset any American production increases. The assumption rested on pre-war observations of American shipbuilding capacity. Before 1941, the United States commissioned submarines at a modest rate, 1 or 2 per month from the handful of yards capable of building them. The Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, held a near monopoly on commercial submarine construction. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine built submarines at peacetime rates. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California contributed smaller numbers. In peacetime, from 1925 through 1940, American submarine production averaged fewer than 2 boats per month. Japanese planners projected this peacetime rate forward, assuming wartime mobilization might double or triple production. They estimated the United States might commission 5 submarines monthly at peak production, perhaps 60 per year if American industry achieved maximum efficiency. This represented, in Japanese calculations, a manageable threat. Japan could sink American submarines at roughly the rate America built them, maintaining an equilibrium that preserved Japan's merchant fleet and resource imports. What Japanese planners could not envision, could not force themselves to believe even when evidence mounted, was that American industrial capacity operated on a scale fundamentally different from anything in their experience. The United States did not merely increase submarine production, it revolutionized submarine construction through mass production techniques previously applied only to simpler vessels. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard provides the clearest example of this transformation. In 1940, Portsmouth launched 1 submarine from each of its 4 building ways per year, completing boats in 20 to 22 months from keel laying. Peacetime rates reflected careful, methodical construction by skilled craftsmen building complex vessels. After Pearl Harbor, Portsmouth immediately implemented shift work and accelerated construction schedules. By mid-1941, before America entered the war, launching time had dropped to 6 months. Then came the truly revolutionary changes. Portsmouth began construction of 6 additional building ways in early 1942. 1 was completed in March, 3 in November, 2 in December. These additional ways, combined with systematic application of prefabrication techniques, enabled production rates that seemed impossible by pre-war standards. Portsmouth simultaneously adopted Electric Boat Company's method of fabricating submarine sections in shops, then welding them together on building ways. 20 sections per submarine, some weighing 50 tons, were manufactured in parallel by different work crews. When one submarine left a building way, the prefabricated sections for the next were ready for immediate assembly. The learning curve was dramatic. After personnel had been increased rapidly in 1940 and the new workforce trained, construction costs initially rose to a maximum of 2,080,000 man-hours of direct labor per submarine. Thereafter, costs fell steadily as workers gained experience and processes improved. By early 1944, construction time had dropped to 640,000 man-hours per submarine, a reduction of more than 2/3. What once required 22 months now took 6 months or less. The results transformed submarine warfare through sheer industrial force. By late 1943, Portsmouth alone reached a production rate of 30 submarines per year. Not 1 or 2 per year, as in peacetime. 30. The single yard outproduced Japan's entire submarine construction program, and Portsmouth represented only one of multiple American yards now building submarines. Electric Boat Company, which had held a near monopoly on commercial submarine construction before the war, expanded dramatically. The company added 3 new slipways to its Connecticut yard and constructed an entirely new facility called Victory Yard downstream from the main yard, with 10 additional slipways. Electric Boat alone would construct more than 40 Gato-class submarines during the war, building them at multiple facilities simultaneously. The Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, located on Lake Michigan hundreds of miles from any ocean, began submarine construction in 1941. Despite having no previous submarine experience and requiring completed boats to be transported through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River to reach the Gulf of Mexico, Manitowoc would build 28 submarines during the war. The company proved that submarine construction could be accomplished even by yards with no maritime access, a testament to American industrial adaptability. Cramp Shipbuilding in Philadelphia entered submarine production, as did Boston Navy Yard. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California increased its production from peacetime levels. By mid-1943, American submarine production reached what would have been considered impossible in 1941. 7 new submarines per month entering service, not 7 per year. 7 per month, 84 submarines annually from an industrial base operating at full capacity. The numbers became more staggering when examined cumulatively. Between December 1941 and December 1942, American shipyards commissioned approximately 40 submarines. In 1943 alone, they commissioned approximately 86 submarines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In 1944, production peaked at approximately 96 submarines. The Gato class alone saw 77 boats constructed, followed by 120 Balao-class submarines. By August 1945, the United States had commissioned more than 200 new submarines during the war, roughly one submarine entering service every 6 days at peak production. Overall, 263 United States submarines undertook war patrols during the conflict. Japanese naval intelligence tracked these numbers, with mounting alarm. Even accounting for American submarine losses, which averaged fewer than one boat per month through mid-war, the mathematics were inexorable. The United States submarine force was not merely growing, it was growing exponentially, while Japanese anti-submarine capabilities remained essentially static. By early 1944, more than 200 American submarines operated in the Pacific, each capable of 60-day patrols across vast ocean areas. The Americans could maintain continuous coverage of every major Japanese shipping route simultaneously. But raw numbers told only part of the story. American submarines were not distributed randomly across the Pacific. They were positioned systematically to interdict Japan's resource flow with devastating efficiency. American naval planners understood what Japanese strategists had fatally underestimated. Merchant shipping was not a secondary target, but the primary vulnerability of an island empire dependent on overseas resources. Japan required approximately 6 million tons of annual shipping capacity to maintain its economy and military during major war. Before the war, Japanese planners had estimated the nation needed 5.9 million long tons of shipping to sustain both the domestic economy and military operations. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese merchant fleet capacity totaled 7.6 million tons, providing what seemed a comfortable margin. But this capacity depended on ships completing round-trip voyages and returning to service. Each ship sunk represented not just lost cargo, but lost capacity for future voyages. Each tanker destroyed meant less oil for industry, less aviation fuel for aircraft, less bunker fuel for remaining merchant ships. American submarines concentrated on specific target categories that inflicted maximum economic damage. Tankers received highest priority, particularly after April 13, 1944, when targeting priorities were formally revised. Japan imported nearly all its petroleum from the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia. Without oil, Japanese industry stopped. Without aviation fuel, aircraft remained grounded. Without bunker fuel, merchant ships sat in port unable to move cargo. Sinking one 10,000-ton tanker disrupted Japanese military operations more than sinking 5 cargo ships of equivalent tonnage. After tankers came bulk carriers transporting iron ore, bauxite, coal, and other industrial raw materials. Japan's steel industry depended on iron ore from occupied China and Southeast Asia. Aircraft production required aluminum smelted from imported bauxite. Every bulk carrier sunk reduced Japanese industrial capacity directly and immediately. By 1944, American submarines were sinking ships faster than Japanese factories could process the materials, even if those materials had arrived. Troop transports became another critical target, particularly after mid-1943, when American island-hopping campaigns forced Japan to reinforce isolated garrisons. American submarines inflicted catastrophic losses on Japanese troop convoys. At critical stages of the Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Leyte campaigns, thousands of Japanese soldiers died when submarines torpedoed their transports. Allied submarine attacks killed 1,218 Japanese soldiers and 342 other Imperial Army personnel in 1942 alone, but these numbers escalated dramatically as the war progressed. and Japan attempted to move reinforcements to contested islands. The cumulative effect was economic strangulation. Japanese merchant shipping losses mounted remorselessly. By early 1945, Japanese merchant marine capacity had been reduced to approximately 2 million tons, with only 320,000 tons in condition to carry cargo. The merchant fleet that began the war with 6.4 million tons of capacity had been reduced to less than one-third its original size. Ships were sinking faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. More critically, skilled merchant seamen were dying at rates that made training replacements impossible. Each sinking cost not only the vessel, but the experienced crew needed to operate remaining ships. Commander Kenyo understood these realities with bitter clarity as he watched his convoy crawl towards Sasebo that November morning. The 9 tankers under his protection represented perhaps 60,000 tons of desperately needed fuel oil. If they reached port, that fuel might power aircraft for operations, run generators in war factories, move supplies to forward bases. If American submarines found them, Japan lost not only the fuel but the tankers needed to transport future fuel shipments. Each voyage became more critical, because each voyage might be a tanker's last. At 08:15, Shimakaze's sonar operator reported a contact bearing 290 degrees, range 4,000 meters. Kenyo felt his stomach tighten. He had heard similar reports 11 times in 4 months. 7 times the convoys had escaped through evasive maneuvering. 4 times submarines had penetrated his escort screen. 12 tankers sunk. 900 merchant seamen dead. And always, more submarines appeared to replace those that successfully attacked or withdrew. What Kenyo could not know, standing on his bridge issuing orders to his destroyers, was that the submarine stalking his convoy represented only a tiny fraction of the force now deployed against Japanese shipping. Somewhere to the south, another American submarine patrolled the approaches to the Luzon Strait. To the east, 3 more submarines formed a patrol line across the convoy routes from the Caroline Islands. To the north, submarines watched the Tsushima Strait between Japan and Korea. And behind all these submarines, in shipyards across America, new submarines slid down buildingways every few days, crewed by trained submariners, armed with reliable torpedoes, ready to replace any boats lost to Japanese anti-submarine warfare. The industrial reality was this: the United States could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them, deploy submarines faster than Japan could protect against them, and sustain submarine operations indefinitely while Japanese shipping capacity contracted month by month. The Americans had transformed submarine warfare from tactical raiding into strategic strangulation, and they had done it with industrial capacity that Japan, even at full wartime mobilization, could not hope to match or counter. By August 1944, the rate of American submarine deliveries reached approximately 7 per month. United States submarine losses had averaged less than 1 per month. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming and growing. For every American submarine sunk, 7 new ones entered service. The submarine force that began the war with 56 boats now numbered more than 200, with additional boats arriving weekly. Each new submarine meant another patrol area covered, another convoy route threatened, another section of Japanese sea lanes interdicted. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers like Commander Kenyo was profound. They had been trained to fight a war of decisive fleet actions, of battleship engagements and carrier battles. Instead, they found themselves fighting an invisible enemy that struck merchant convoys with impunity and vanished before counterattacks could be mounted. Every voyage became a gauntlet, every convoy became a target, and behind every American submarine sunk or driven off, 3 more appeared to take its place. The Americans had not simply outbuilt Japan. They had fundamentally transformed how naval warfare determined strategic outcomes in the Pacific. The moment of full comprehension came not in a single dramatic revelation, but through accumulated evidence that Japanese naval leadership could no longer ignore or rationalize. By early 1944, the statistics told a story so devastating that even the most optimistic officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters could not dispute the mathematics of Japan's defeat. In January 1944, American submarines sank Japanese merchant ships totaling approximately 280,000 tons. In February, the figure reached 300,000 tons. March saw losses of 290,000 tons. These were not projections or estimates. These were confirmed sinkings, documented by Japanese naval records, representing actual ships that would never return to port. At this rate of loss, Japan's entire merchant fleet would be destroyed within 18 months, even if no additional ships were sunk, and even if Japanese shipyards operated at maximum capacity. But Japanese shipyards were not operating at maximum capacity. They were struggling to maintain even minimal production while competing with naval construction programs for steel, skilled labor, and resources. In 1944, Japanese shipyards managed to complete approximately 1.7 million tons of merchant shipping. In that same year, American submarines sank approximately 3.5 million tons. For every ton Japan built, American submarines sank 2 tons. The gap was not closing. It was widening with every passing month. Captain Oi Atsushi, serving at Grand Escort Fleet Headquarters, watched these numbers accumulate with growing despair. The Grand Escort Fleet had been established in November 1943, nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor, as a belated recognition that merchant convoy protection required dedicated resources and unified command. Before November 1943, convoy escort had been assigned on an ad hoc basis to whatever destroyers could be spared from fleet operations. No unified communications system existed. No standardized escort procedures had been developed. Destroyer commanders, trained for fleet actions and surface combat, regarded convoy duty as secondary work beneath their skills and training. One destroyer group commander told Oi directly, "We are not trained to accompany merchant vessels, but to fight a fleet action." The statement revealed everything wrong with Japanese naval thinking. The decisive fleet action remained paramount in the minds of officers, even as merchant shipping losses threatened to cripple Japan's ability to continue the war. Destroyers that might have protected convoys were held in reserve for fleet battles that never materialized, while American submarines systematically destroyed Japan's merchant marine. The Grand Escort Fleet represented an attempt to correct this doctrinal blindness, but it came too late and with insufficient resources. At its creation, the Grand Escort Fleet received responsibility for protecting all Japanese merchant shipping. It did not receive adequate ships to perform that mission. Most destroyers remained assigned to the combined fleet for offensive operations. The Grand Escort Fleet made do with older destroyers, converted patrol boats, and newly constructed escort vessels that were neither numerous enough nor sophisticated enough to counter the American submarine threat. Communication problems alone revealed how unprepared Japan was for organized convoy warfare. When Oi assumed his position at Grand Escort Fleet Headquarters, he discovered that communications systems varied according to each escort of convoy area because of utter lack of unified control. While almost all convoys had to sail through 2 or more areas, securing cooperation between neighboring commanders proved nearly impossible. When convoys crossed from one area to another, they often lost radio contact with escort forces because different areas used different radio frequencies and different code systems. American submarines, reading intercepted convoy positions from broken Japanese codes, knew where convoys were located more precisely than Japanese escort commanders in adjacent areas. Even worse, merchant ships and escort vessels lacked facilities for direct communication with aircraft. The Japanese Navy had finally established the 901st Naval Air Group in 1943, dedicated exclusively to anti-submarine warfare. But the group had been formed without established anti-submarine air doctrines because no such doctrines existed in Japanese naval aviation. The airmen had to develop tactical procedures from scratch while simultaneously conducting combat operations. And when they did locate submarines, they often could not coordinate attacks with surface escorts because no communication systems linked aircraft and ships. The monthly shipping loss in November 1943 reached 265,068 gross tons, forcing the untrained air group into premature operations. The fundamental problem was that Japan had never prepared for commerce protection because Japanese naval doctrine assumed commerce raiding would not determine the war's outcome. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, had so dominated Japanese naval thinking that entire branches of naval warfare had been neglected or ignored. Anti-submarine warfare, convoy escort, and maritime commerce protection were regarded as defensive, passive activities unworthy of a modern navy. Officers who should have been studying convoy tactics were instead practicing battleship gunnery. Resources that should have been allocated to escort vessels went to building battleships and carriers for the decisive battle. By mid-1944, the consequences of this doctrinal failure had become undeniable. Japanese oil imports, which had totaled approximately 4.9 million kiloliters in 1941, had fallen to approximately 2.5 million kiloliters. The decline was not gradual but precipitous, reflecting the systematic destruction of tanker capacity by American submarines. By early 1945, oil supplies were so limited that the Japanese fleet was virtually stranded in port, unable to sortie for lack of fuel. The mighty combined fleet, built around battleships and carriers that embodied the decisive battle doctrine, sat immobile because American submarines had severed the oil lifeline from Southeast Asia. In May and June 1944, the Japanese First Mobile Fleet stayed at Tawi-Tawi in preparation for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The fleet wanted to send carriers to sea to train pilots. Instead, carriers remained in port because submarines prowled the waters outside the base, and fuel was too precious to risk on training exercises. When the fleet finally sortied for the Philippine Sea battle in June, it did so with inadequately trained pilots who had missed critical training hours. American submarines had achieved strategic effects before the battle even began by restricting Japanese training operations. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound and disorienting. They had spent their entire careers preparing for fleet actions modelled on Tsushima, battleship duels fought at ranges of 15 to 20,000 yards, carrier battles decided by massed airstrikes, cruiser engagements conducted according to established tactical principles. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy they rarely saw, attacking targets that vanished underwater, defending convoys against submarines that struck without warning and disappeared before counterattacks could be organized. Commander Kenyo's experience on that November morning in 1944 exemplified the frustration and futility Japanese escort commanders faced daily. When Shimakaze's sonar detected the submarine at 0815, Kenyo ordered his destroyers to attack, while the convoy executed an emergency turn away from the threat. Standard procedure, practiced countless times in training exercises. His destroyers raced toward the contact, sonar operators calling out bearings and ranges. At 1,000 meters, the destroyers began dropping depth charges in patterns designed to bracket the submarine's probable position. But the American submarine commander had no intention of pressing his attack against alerted escorts. The moment the destroyers turned toward him, he went deep and silent, drifting below the thermal layer where Japanese sonar could not reliably detect him. Kenyo's destroyers dropped 52 depth charges over the next 40 minutes, creating massive underwater explosions that should have destroyed any submarine in the area. When the depth charging finally ceased and the destroyers returned to the convoy, Kenyo could not confirm a kill. No oil slick appeared, no debris surfaced. The submarine had simply vanished. 6 hours later, as the convoy approached the Shimonoseki Strait, a different American submarine attacked from the opposite side. This time, there were no warning sonar contacts. The first indication of danger was a torpedo explosion that tore open the hull of the lead tanker. Before Kenyo's destroyers could react, 2 more torpedoes struck 2 other tankers. In less than 3 minutes, 3 ships were sinking. The submarine that had fired those torpedoes was already diving deep, moving away from the attack site at 4 knots, silent and undetectable. Kenyo's destroyers searched for 5 hours. They dropped 138 depth charges. They detected multiple sonar contacts that might have been submarines or might have been thermal layers, schools of fish, or ocean currents. They confirmed nothing. When darkness fell, Kenyo ordered the surviving 6 tankers to proceed to port under maximum possible speed while his destroyers continued searching through the night. They found nothing. 6 tankers reached port. 3 had been lost. The pattern had repeated exactly as it had repeated dozens of times across every Japanese convoy route that month. This pattern repeated across every Japanese convoy route in the Pacific. American submarines struck, sank ships, and escaped before escorts could mount effective counterattacks. Japanese anti-submarine warfare claimed successes, but the statistics revealed the truth. Through 1944, the Japanese military claimed to have sunk 468 Allied submarines. The actual number was 42 United States submarines lost in the Pacific theater, with 10 others lost to accidents or friendly fire. The Japanese were overclaiming submarine kills by a factor of 9 to 1, seeing successful attacks where none existed, counting probable kills that were actually escaped submarines, inflating statistics to hide the reality that American submarine losses were negligible compared to the destruction they inflicted. The mathematics were inexorable and undeniable. By early 1945, American submarines had sunk approximately 5.2 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, representing 1,314 ships. They had also sunk 201 Japanese naval vessels, totaling 540,000 tons, including 1 battleship and 8 aircraft carriers. During the Battle of Midway, I-168 had administered the coup de grace that sank USS Yorktown, and I-19 had famously sunk USS Wasp in September 1942. But these Japanese submarine successes were isolated achievements compared to the systematic destruction American submarines inflicted on Japanese shipping. The submarines' toll on Japanese warships was remarkable, but their destruction of merchant shipping was decisive. They had sunk 56% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. They had cut Japan's maritime cargo capacity from approximately 6 million tons at the live war's start to 2 million tons by August 1945, with only 320,000 tons in operational condition. The Cabinet of Japan would later report to the National Diet that the greatest cause of defeat was the loss of shipping. The impact on Japan's war economy was catastrophic and comprehensive. Industrial production collapsed as raw materials stopped arriving. Steel production, which had peaked at approximately 7 million tons in 1943, fell to less than 1 million tons in 1945. Aluminum production ceased almost entirely as bauxite shipments from Southeast Asia ended. Aircraft production, which should have increased to meet American bombing campaigns, instead declined because aluminum and aviation fuel could not reach factories. By mid-1945, Japanese aircraft often sat grounded for lack of fuel, even when pilots and planes were available. Food imports suffered equally devastating reductions. Japan imported substantial amounts of rice, soybeans, and other foodstuffs from Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia to feed both military forces and civilian populations. As merchant shipping declined, food imports fell proportionally. Civilian rations in Japanese cities dropped to approximately 1,040 calories per day by early 1945, well below subsistence level. Malnutrition became widespread. Infant mortality increased. The Japanese government began preparing for mass starvation in the event of Allied invasion because the nation lacked the shipping capacity to move food from agricultural areas to cities, even within the home islands. Yet even as Japanese leaders acknowledged this reality in 1945, they struggled to comprehend the industrial disparity that had made such destruction possible. The United States had not simply deployed more submarines than Japan anticipated. It had deployed more submarines than Japan had considered physically possible for any nation to build. The scale of American industrial mobilization exceeded Japanese experience and imagination. Consider the broader context of American wartime production. While building 250-plus submarines, American shipyards simultaneously constructed 22 Essex-class aircraft carriers, 4 Iowa-class battleships, hundreds of destroyers, thousands of landing craft, and nearly 6,000 merchant ships through the Emergency Shipbuilding Program. In 4 years, American industrial production doubled in size. The United States produced 297,000 aircraft during the war, more than 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. American industry provided almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment produced during the war. American industrial production ultimately accounted for more than half of all industrial production in the world by 1944. America launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan did in the entire war. By the autumn of 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. In 1944 alone, the United States built more planes than Japan did from 1939 to 1945. After the Battle of Midway in 1942, the Japanese built 6 aircraft carriers in the following 3 years. The United States built 17 in that same period. Japanese industrial capacity, substantial by Asian standards, could not approach these numbers. Japan built 65 submarines during the war years while losing 130 submarines to combat and accidents. Japanese aircraft production peaked at approximately 28,000 aircraft in 1944, less than 1/10 of American production. Japanese merchant ship construction totaled approximately 4 million tons during the war, less than the tonnage American. Submarines sank. Every category of production revealed the same pattern. American industry outproduced Japanese industry by factors of 5, 10, or 20 to 1. The submarine disparity exemplified this broader industrial gap. Where Japanese shipyards struggled to maintain production of 1 or 2 submarines monthly, American yards routinely launched 7 or 8, where Japan built submarines through traditional craftsman-based methods that required 18 to 24 months per boat. American yards implemented prefabrication systems that reduced construction time to 6 months or less. Where Japan allocated scarce resources among competing priorities, often choosing battleship or carrier construction over submarines, American industry possessed sufficient resources to build everything simultaneously. The contrast extended beyond mere numbers to questions of strategic vision and adaptability. When American submariners discovered their torpedoes were defective, the Navy conducted systematic tests, identified the problems, and implemented solutions within 18 months. When American submarines initially operated ineffectively, Admiral Lockwood replaced cautious commanders with aggressive officers and revised tactical doctrines to emphasize commerce raiding. When codebreakers cracked Japanese convoy routing systems, the Navy integrated signals intelligence into submarine operations within weeks. The Maru Code, broken in January 1943, transformed submarine effectiveness almost immediately. Japan made no comparable adaptations. Despite mounting evidence that commerce protection required urgent attention, the combined fleet refused to release destroyers from fleet service for convoy escort until catastrophic shipping losses forced the issue in late 1943. Even then, resources allocated to convoy protection remained insufficient. Japanese depth charges were set to explode at depths too shallow to damage American submarines diving below 200 feet. This defect became publicly known after United States Congressman Andrew May revealed in 1943 that Japanese depth charges were not set deep enough. While it has never been definitively established that May's disclosure prompted Japanese tactical changes, Japanese anti-submarine warfare did improve somewhat in effectiveness after mid-1943, particularly with the deployment of radar. However, these improvements came far too late to alter the war's trajectory. The doctrinal inflexibility that prevented rapid adaptation stemmed partly from the structure of Japanese military leadership. Unlike the United States, where civilian control ensured that strategic priorities reflected national objectives rather than service preferences, Japan's military services operated with substantial autonomy from civilian oversight. The Army and Navy functioned as competing hierarchies, often working at cross purposes. The Navy itself split between the combined fleet, which controlled operational forces, and the Naval General Staff, which controlled planning and strategy. Inter-service and intra-service rivalries delayed or prevented necessary adaptations, even when problems became obvious. Captain Oi recalled after the war that unless the Naval General Staff itself was ready to shoulder all responsibility, it proved impossible for anyone to counterbalance the unbridled influence of the combined fleet. The combined fleet wanted to preserve destroyers for offensive fleet operations. Therefore, Destroyers were not allocated to convoy escort, regardless of merchant shipping losses. The combined fleet wanted to use escort carriers for fleet carrier training rather than anti-submarine patrols. Therefore, the few escort carriers Japan possessed never functioned effectively as convoy defense platforms. When escort carriers were assigned to convoy duty, most were soon transferred to combined fleet carriers for training purposes. The convoys escorted by these carriers met no better fate than others, and the carriers themselves fell victim to enemy submarines. By mid-1944, some Japanese naval officers began to understand that the war was lost not because of any single battle or campaign, but because of cumulative industrial attrition that Japan could not reverse. The Americans were not winning through superior tactics or better training, though both played roles. They were winning through sheer material preponderance, more submarines than could be sunk, more torpedoes than could be evaded, more industrial capacity than could be matched. Captain Ome Toshikazu, serving on the Naval General Staff, later described the growing awareness among Japanese officers that they faced an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. Every month brought more American submarines, every month saw more ships sunk. Every month Japan's situation worsened while America's improved. Japanese officers could see no end to American capacity for production. The realization was psychologically devastating for men trained to believe that spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond professional despair. It challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern wars were fought and won. Japanese military doctrine since Meiji Restoration had emphasized spirit, training, and tactical excellence as equalizers against numerically superior enemies. At Tsushima, in 1905, superior Japanese training and tactics had defeated a larger Russian fleet. Japanese planners assumed similar advantages would offset American material superiority in any Pacific War. They were preparing to win through excellence, through Bushido spirit, through superior fighting quality. But American submarines revealed the limitations of such thinking. It did not matter if Japanese destroyer crews were better trained than American submarine crews, if Japan possessed too few destroyers to protect its convoys. It did not matter if individual Japanese escort vessels performed courageously, if American submarines outnumbered escorts by ratios of 10 or 20 to 1. Quality could not compensate for quantity when the quantity gap reached orders of magnitude. The decisive battle doctrine had prepared Japan for Tsushima. It had not prepared Japan for a war of industrial attrition against an enemy with virtually unlimited productive capacity. The American submarine campaign also revealed another uncomfortable truth. Modern industrial warfare rewarded different virtues than traditional military thinking emphasized. The decisive factors were not courage or tactical brilliance but production capacity, logistical systems, resource allocation, and industrial organization. The Americans won not by outfighting Japan, but by outbuilding Japan, by creating military-industrial systems that generated weapons faster than enemies could destroy them. This represented a kind of warfare. Japanese military culture was unprepared to understand or counter. Japanese naval officers, trained in the Bushido tradition, educated in the glorious history of Tsushima, indoctrinated in the primacy of offensive action and decisive battle, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused decisive battle, that valued production over valor, that won through material abundance rather than tactical excellence. The cultural disconnect was profound and ultimately unbridgeable. The final statistics, compiled after the war by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, told the story with mathematical precision. United States submarines, comprising less than 2% of the United States Navy, sank 30% of Japanese naval vessels by tonnage and 60% of Japanese merchant shipping by tonnage. They destroyed approximately 5.2 million tons of merchant shipping and 540,000 tons of warships. They laid 18,553 mines in Japanese waters. They rescued hundreds of downed Allied airmen, including future President George H.W. Bush. They conducted reconnaissance missions that provided intelligence for major operations, notably at the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. They landed special forces on enemy-held islands, and they accomplished all this while losing 52 boats to enemy action, a casualty rate of 22%. That was the highest of any American service, but still represented remarkably low losses given the operational tempo and the tonnage destroyed. The American submarine force ultimately undertook more than 1,400 war patrols during the Pacific War. At any given time after mid-1943, approximately 100 American submarines were deployed on patrol, with another 100 in port for resupply, maintenance, and crew rest. The rotation system ensured continuous coverage of Japanese shipping lanes. No convoy route was safe. No resupply run went uncontested. Japanese merchant ships attempting to reach isolated garrisons or transport resources to home islands faced submarine attacks at every stage of their voyages. By early 1945, American submarines had become so successful that they struggled to find targets. The tonnage of Japanese merchant shipping still afloat had declined to the point where submarines sometimes patrolled for weeks without sighting suitable targets. The campaign had achieved what pre-war planners would have considered impossible: the virtual elimination of an enemy's merchant marine, while that enemy still possessed territory, armies, and the will to fight. The war against shipping was the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy. Commander Kenyo never learned the full scope of what he faced that November morning in 1944. He survived the war, his destroyer Shimakaze having been reassigned to Home Island's defense in January 1945. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Kenyo was among the officers who compiled data on shipping losses for the post-war assessment. Reading through the statistics, understanding for the first time the scale of American submarine deployments and the disparity in production capacity, Kenyo later wrote in his private journal that he felt relief mixed with horror. Relief that the war had ended before complete collapse. Horror at the realization that Japan had been fighting an unwinnable war from the moment the first American submarine cleared Pearl Harbor. What Japanese commanders could not believe about American submarine deployment was not merely the numbers, though the numbers were staggering. It was the industrial system behind those numbers, the capacity to design, build, deploy, support, and sustain a submarine force larger than Japan's entire merchant fleet. It was the strategic vision to recognize that commerce raiding, dismissed by both navies' pre-war doctrines as secondary, would become the decisive naval campaign of the Pacific War. It was the adaptability to correct torpedo problems, revise tactics, integrate signals, intelligence, and transform submarine operations from ineffective gestures in 1942 to devastating campaigns in 1944. The aftermath of Japan's submarine crisis began even before the war ended. By June 1945, American submarines had effectively run out of targets. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had totaled more than 6 million tons in December 1941, had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in ports or making desperate coastal runs. The great sea lanes that once connected Japan to its empire now lay empty. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies no longer made the journey to Japanese refineries. Ore carriers from Southeast Asia sat idle or at the bottom of the Pacific. Food shipments from Korea traveled by small coastal vessels that hugged the shoreline, hoping to avoid submarines patrolling offshore. In the final months of the war, American submarines shifted their operations from commerce raiding to direct support of the invasion forces massing for the assault on Japan's home islands. They conducted reconnaissance of landing beaches, destroyed remaining Japanese naval vessels, and positioned themselves to rescue downed airmen from the massive bombing campaigns that devastated Japanese cities. The submarine war, in its original purpose of destroying merchant shipping, had already been won. Japan's maritime economy had ceased to function. The human cost of this victory was staggering on both sides. Of the approximately 16,000 American submariners who served in the Pacific, 3,500 never returned, a casualty rate of 22%. This was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. Submarine duty was extraordinarily dangerous. 52 American submarines were lost to enemy action. When a submarine went down, few crew members survived. The boats operated alone, far from support, in waters controlled by the enemy. If depth charges or torpedoes breached the hull at depth, there was no escape, no rescue, no survival. Japanese losses were even more severe. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 130 submarines during the war, most to American anti-submarine warfare. But these losses paled beside the toll among Japanese merchant seamen. Approximately 116,000 merchant mariners served in the Japanese merchant fleet during the war. Approximately 60,000 died when their ships were sunk by submarines, aircraft, or mines. The survival rate for Japanese merchant seamen was among the lowest of any occupational group in any nation during the war. The broader toll among Japanese military personnel transported aboard merchant vessels remains difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest American submarines killed between 100,000 and 200,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors by sinking troop transports. At critical moments in key campaigns, entire battalions disappeared beneath the Pacific before reaching their destinations. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan's last major naval operation, was fought partly by forces depleted because submarines had sunk the transports carrying reinforcements. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, the scale of the submarine victory became fully apparent to Japanese military leaders who had access to complete statistics for the first time. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, who had commanded the combined fleet, later acknowledged that the submarine campaign had been more devastating than any other aspect of the war. Coming from an officer who had witnessed atomic bombs, carrier raids, and the firebombing of Japanese cities, this assessment carried profound weight. Captain Oyatsushi, who had struggled throughout 1944 and 1945 to organize effective convoy protection with inadequate resources, wrote extensively after the war about the doctrinal failures that had left Japan vulnerable. His analysis, published in 1952 in the United States Naval Institute Proceedings under the title Why Japan's Anti-Submarine Warfare Failed, provided the most comprehensive Japanese perspective on the submarine crisis. Oy identified multiple factors: inadequate pre-war preparation, inter-service rivalries, insufficient resources allocated to convoy protection, poor communications systems, and lack of unified command. But underlying all these specific failures was the fundamental doctrinal assumption that commerce warfare would not determine the war's outcome. The contrast with Allied naval operations in the Atlantic was instructive. The British Royal Navy, facing German U-boat campaigns in both world wars, had developed sophisticated convoy systems, dedicated escort vessels, signals intelligence networks, and tactical doctrines specifically for anti-submarine warfare. When German submarines threatened to sever Britain's maritime lifelines in 1940 and 1941, the Royal Navy possessed institutional knowledge and operational frameworks to respond. Convoy protection was not improvised. It was refined and improved from established foundations. Japan had no such foundations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had never faced a serious submarine threat. It had never developed convoy protection doctrines. Its officers had never trained for escort duty. When the American submarine campaign began in earnest in 1943, Japan had to build anti-submarine warfare capabilities from scratch while simultaneously losing ships at catastrophic rates. The Grand Escort Fleet, established in November 1943, represented an attempt to create in months what the Royal Navy had developed over decades. It was, inevitably, too little and too late. The industrial disparity that enabled American submarine dominance also shaped the post-war order in profound ways. Japan's defeat in the Pacific War resulted not from any single battle or campaign, but from systematic industrial exhaustion. American production capacity had simply overwhelmed Japanese capacity across every category of warfare: aircraft, ships, munitions, vehicles, and submarines. The margin of American victory was so complete that it fundamentally altered how military strategists thought about modern warfare. The submarine campaign became a case study in strategic studies programs worldwide. It demonstrated that in industrial age warfare, production capacity could be as decisive as tactical brilliance. It showed that strategic vision mattered more than traditional military virtues, when that vision correctly identified enemy vulnerabilities. It proved that technological systems like signals, intelligence, and reliable torpedoes could transform military effectiveness when integrated properly into operational doctrine. For the United States Navy, the submarine campaign validated investment in submarine technology and training. In the post-war period, as the Cold War emerged and nuclear propulsion revolutionized submarine design, American submarine doctrine built on lessons learned in the Pacific. The emphasis on aggressive independent operations, on technological superiority in sonar and weapons systems, on meticulous crew training and selection, all derived partly from Pacific War experience. For Japan, the submarine disaster shaped post-war naval thinking in opposite directions. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in 1954 under American occupation guidance, focused heavily on anti-submarine warfare. Japan's geographic position, dependence on maritime trade, and Cold War alignment with the United States made protection of sea lanes a strategic imperative. Japanese naval planners, remembering how American submarines had strangled Imperial Japan, built defensive capabilities designed to prevent any future enemy from replicating that success. By the end of the 20th century, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force was widely regarded as possessing some of the world's most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare capabilities. The human stories behind the statistics provide perhaps the most lasting legacy of the submarine campaign. Men like Commander Kenyo, who survived the war and spent decades afterward teaching at Japan's Naval Academy, shaped how post-war generations understood the conflict. Kenyo's lectures emphasized material factors over traditional military virtues, industrial capacity over tactical excellence. He taught that modern wars were won not on battlefields alone, but in factories, shipyards, and resource allocation committees. American submariners who survived the war carried their own lessons forward. Many remained in the Navy through the Cold War, commanding nuclear submarines that extended American power globally. The submarine force's culture of meticulous preparation, aggressive execution, and technological mastery influenced post-war American naval development and, more broadly, American approaches to Cold War military competition. The specific commanders and crews who prosecuted the submarine campaign achieved varying degrees of recognition. Admiral Charles Lockwood, whose leadership transformed American submarine operations from ineffective to devastating, received considerable credit both during and after the war. His subordinate commanders, men like Dudley Mush Morton of USS Wahoo, Richard O'Kane of USS Tang, and Samuel Dealey of USS Harder, became legends within the submarine community. Morton died when Wahoo was sunk in October 1943 while exiting the Sea of Japan, but his aggressive patrol tactics influenced an entire generation of submarine commanders. O'Kane survived the sinking of USS Tang in October 1944 after his own torpedo circled back and struck his submarine. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner and later received the Medal of Honor. Dealey sank 5 Japanese destroyers, 4 in a single patrol, before USS Harder was lost in August 1944. USS Tang sank 33 ships, more than any other American submarine, with O'Kane's aggressive tactics setting standards that other commanders studied. On the Japanese side, the men who tried to counter the submarine threat received less recognition but deserved equal respect for attempting an impossible task with inadequate resources. Officers like Commander Kenyo, who escorted convoys through submarine-infested waters knowing that each voyage might be their last, demonstrated courage that transcended national boundaries. Merchant seamen who continued to crew tankers and cargo vessels, despite survival rates below 50%, showed a different kind of valor than soldiers in ground combat. The technological legacy of the submarine campaign influenced post-war naval development in multiple ways. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, introduced in 1943, became the basis for post-war American torpedo development. The sonar systems that American submarines used to detect targets and evade counterattacks evolved into increasingly sophisticated post-war systems. More broadly, the integration of signals intelligence into submarine operations pioneered techniques that became standard in Cold War military operations. The economic impact of the submarine campaign extended well beyond immediate wartime effects. Japan's post-war economic recovery was built partly on recognition that resource security required either domestic production or guaranteed access to maritime trade routes. The trauma of wartime resource starvation, when Japanese factories shut down for lack of raw materials, and Japanese civilians went hungry for lack of food imports, shaped post-war industrial policy. Japan invested heavily in resource-efficient manufacturing, developing technologies that extracted maximum value from minimal inputs. The submarine campaign also influenced American strategic thinking about how to project power in the Pacific. The success of commerce warfare against an island nation dependent on imports validated strategies based on maritime interdiction rather than direct assault. During the Cold War, American naval planners developed contingency plans that drew explicitly on Pacific War submarine experience. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s, as official histories were declassified and veterans began writing memoirs, that the full story of the Pacific submarine campaign became publicly known. The submarine war was largely invisible to contemporaries and remained partially invisible to historians for decades afterward. It lacked the visual drama of carrier operations or amphibious assaults. It occurred in the depths of the ocean, far from observation, documented primarily through radio messages and post-patrol reports. Yet measured by strategic impact, the submarine campaign was arguably the single most decisive naval operation of the Pacific War. It did what carrier battles and island campaigns could not. It systematically destroyed Japan's ability to sustain modern warfare. By August 1945, when atomic bombs finally forced Japanese surrender, the submarine campaign had already achieved Japan's economic defeat. Japanese industry had ceased meaningful production for lack of raw materials. The Japanese military could not move forces or supplies for lack of shipping. Japanese civilians faced starvation for lack of food imports. Commander Kenyo, teaching at the Naval Academy in the 1950s and 1960s, would conclude his lectures on the submarine campaign with an observation that became famous among his students. The Americans won the war before most of us realized we were losing it. While we prepared for the decisive battle, they were sinking our merchant ships. While we preserved our destroyers for fleet action, they were destroying our economy. While we focused on tactics, they focused on logistics. We could not believe how many submarines they deployed because we could not imagine an industrial system capable of building them. That failure of imagination cost us the war. The final assessment of the Pacific submarine campaign must acknowledge both its effectiveness and its broader implications. American submarines, numbering never more than 240 deployed simultaneously and representing less than 2% of United States naval strength, sank 56% of all Japanese shipping lost during the war. They accomplished this with remarkably low losses, 52 boats to enemy action from approximately 288 submarines that conducted war patrols. The exchange ratio was devastatingly in America's favor. This effectiveness resulted from multiple factors working in concert. Reliable torpedoes after September 1943 eliminated technical problems. Aggressive commanders selected by Admiral Lockwood maximized offensive opportunities. Signals intelligence from broken Japanese codes provided precise convoy routing information. Long-range fleet submarines designed specifically for Pacific operations could patrol for 60 days without refueling. Excellent crew training ensured technical proficiency. Systematic rotation policies kept experienced boats operational, but underlying all these operational factors was the industrial capacity that made sustained operations possible. American shipyards built submarines faster than combat losses occurred. American industry provided unlimited torpedoes, fuel, food, and spare parts. American training facilities produced skilled crews faster than casualties depleted the submarine force. The United States could absorb losses and continue operations indefinitely. Japan could not. The strategic lesson was clear. In industrial age warfare between powers of vastly unequal productive capacity, the stronger industrial power possessed decisive advantages that tactical skill could not overcome. Japanese naval officers were as skilled and courageous as their American counterparts. Japanese destroyers were in many cases technically superior to American vessels. None of this mattered when facing an enemy that built 7 submarines for every one Japan sank. The historical irony was that Japan had recognized these realities before the war began. Japanese naval planners had calculated that war with the United States would require rapid victories before American industrial mobilization reached full capacity. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, famously predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months, or a year, but could not sustain a long war against American industrial power. The entire Japanese strategy depended on achieving decisive victories that would force American acceptance of Japanese conquests before American industry overwhelmed Japanese capacity. This strategy failed because American industrial mobilization proceeded faster than Japan anticipated. American willingness to accept casualties exceeded Japanese predictions, and American strategic adaptability allowed rapid doctrinal changes. The legacy of this miscalculation extends beyond World War II to broader questions about how military organizations learn and adapt. Japan's failure to effectively counter the submarine threat, despite mounting evidence, reflected institutional rigidities that transcended individual competence. The officers who served in the Grand Escort Fleet were not incompetent. They were trying to solve problems their institution had never prepared them to address, using resources their leadership would not provide, fighting a kind of warfare their doctrine regarded as peripheral. American success resulted from opposite tendencies. American military culture valued innovation. American industrial capacity provided resources for experimentation. American civilian oversight ensured that strategic priorities reflected national interests. When submarine operations proved ineffective in 1942, systemic changes followed quickly. When technology created opportunities, American forces exploited them rapidly. The submarine campaign thus became more than a military operation. It became a demonstration of how industrial democracies could organize total war more effectively than military autocracies. For Japan, the memory of submarine strangulation remained painful for decades. The post-war emphasis on anti-submarine warfare reflected determination never again to face such vulnerability. For the United States, the submarine campaign validated approaches that would characterize American military power throughout the Cold War. Technological superiority, industrial abundance, strategic innovation, and aggressive execution. The men who fought the submarine war, on both sides, carried their experiences forward into post-war lives that shaped both nations. In the end, what Japanese commanders could not believe about American submarine deployment was not simply a matter of numbers. It was a revelation about the nature of modern war itself. Wars between industrial powers are won not just on battlefields but in factories, not just through tactical brilliance but through strategic vision, not just by fighting forces but by the industrial systems that supply those forces. The submarines that prowled the Pacific from 1941 to 1945 were more than weapons. They were instruments of strategic victory, tools of economic warfare, and embodiments of American industrial power. Each submarine represented hundreds of tons of steel, thousands of hours of skilled labor, and ultimately, a fragment of the productive capacity that decided the war's outcome. Japan could not match that capacity, could not counter those submarines, and could not sustain the war once American industrial mobilization reached full strength. Commander Kenyo understood this by war's end. Standing amid the ruins of a defeated nation in August 1945, he finally grasped what he had been fighting against. Not just submarines or torpedoes, but the entire productive capacity of an industrial superpower that could build faster than enemies could destroy, deploy faster than enemies could counter, and sustain operations longer than enemies could endure. The Americans had not simply deployed more submarines than Japan anticipated. They had deployed more submarines than Japan could imagine, backed by an industrial system Japan could not comprehend. That was the truth Japanese commanders finally accepted when the war ended. That was the lesson that shaped post-war strategic thinking, and that was the reality that determined the Pacific War's outcome. Not courage against courage, but industrial might against inadequate resources, production capacity against scarcity, and American abundance against Japanese limitations. The submarines won because behind them stood the factories, shipyards, and industrial power of a mobilized America that Japan could neither match nor defeat. The story of Japanese commanders confronting American submarine deployment is ultimately a story of how wars are won in the industrial age, through production, logistics, and the unglamorous but decisive work of building more weapons than enemies can sink, deploying more forces than enemies can defeat, and sustaining operations longer than enemies can endure. In that contest, America's submarines proved decisive not because they were invincible, but because they were replaceable, and that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.